In the autumn of 1887, on the windswept plains of the Dakota Territory, the people of Prairie Ridge saw Elspeth Muir doing something that made no sense. They saw a widow, barely a year into her grief, hauling fieldstone in a rickety wheelbarrow, not to her small, respectable cabin, but to the abandoned old stone church at the edge of town, a place no one had prayed in for 20 years, a place the wind had claimed as its own. Most people thought she'd lost her mind to sorrow. They saw her digging trenches behind the crumbling foundation, her face smudged with dirt, her dress hemmed with mud. They saw her wrestling with clay and water, forming crude pipes with her bare hands. The town's consensus was simple and sad. The grief had broken her. And when the winter of 1888 hit, a winter that would be spoken of in hushed tones for a generation, that crazy work at the old church would prove the difference between survival and surrender. It would prove the difference between a town shivering in the dark and a refuge of impossible warmth. If you want to hear the number that made the territory's most experienced builders go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet widow, a woman with no formal training, understand about heat and stone that every man in Prairie Ridge had missed? Let's find out. And as we go, do me a favor and subscribe for more stories of quiet competence. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Elspeth Muir wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 34-year-old widow trying to keep her 2 children from freezing. Her husband, Thomas, had been a mining engineer, a quiet man who saw the world in layers of rock and pressure. He'd come to the Dakotas not for gold, but for coal seams, and he'd taught Elspeth to see the land not as a flat surface, but as a living thing with a hot heart. He'd talk about geology the way other men talked about horses or cattle. He'd point to a wisp of steam from a fissure in the rock and say, "That's the earth breathing, Elspeth. That's deep heat finding a way out." He died in a shaft collapse the previous spring, leaving her with 2 children, 8-year-old Caleb and 6-year-old Anna, and a small cabin on land owned by her brother-in-law, Arthur. By frontier standards, the cabin was more than respectable. It was tightly chinked, with a good fieldstone hearth and a solid roof. Thomas had built it himself. But a cabin is only as warm as the wood you can feed it. Her first winter alone was a brutal lesson in thermodynamics. The wind on the plains wasn't just cold. It was a physical force. It didn't just chill the air. It stripped heat directly from the log walls. She burned through 5 cords of wood, more than her husband had ever used. She spent her days chopping, hauling, and feeding the stove, a constant, exhausting battle against the cold that was always winning. The suffering was specific. Her children slept in their coats, huddled under every blanket they owned. Elspeth stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. A bucket of water left 10 feet from the stove would have a skin of ice on it by dawn. The cabin's air temperature rarely climbed above 45 degrees, even with the stove glowing red. It wasn't a home. It was a shelter where the cold was slightly less lethal than it was outside. She remembered Thomas's words. "You can't fight a prairie winter with just a fire. The wind will steal the heat faster than you can make it. You have to fight the wind itself." That thought nagged at her all summer. Then, in August, the letter of the law came in the form of her brother-in-law. Arthur was a good man, but a practical one. He was remarrying. He needed the cabin for his new family. He gave her until the 1st of October. He wasn't cruel about it. He offered to help her build a small sod house further out. But Elspeth knew what a sod house was in a real winter. A damp, cold tomb. She was being kicked out. Politely, legally, but kicked out all the same. Desperate, she walked the edge of the townlands, her mind racing, and then she saw it. The old stone church. It stood on a low rise, built by hopeful German immigrants 2 decades prior, abandoned when the congregation moved to a new building in the town center. Its windows were boarded, its cross tilted, but the stone walls were solid. And behind it, nestled in a rocky outcrop, was the fissure. The one Thomas had shown her years ago. On this warm August day, you could barely see it. But in the winter, a steady plume of steam rose from it, melting the snow in a perfect circle. Geothermal, Thomas had called it. The Earth's own furnace. Her plan was simple and, to everyone else, insane. She wouldn't just move into the church. She would heat it with the ground itself. She went to Arthur. "I'll take the old church." He stared at her. "Elspeth, it's a ruin. It has no stove, no chimney. The floor is flagstone. It would take 10 cords of wood just to take the chill off the stones." "I don't plan on using a stove," she said, her voice steady. Arthur just shook his head, a look of deep pity in his eyes. He agreed, likely thinking it was a temporary fantasy. He gave her the deed. The church and the 2 acres it sat on were worthless to anyone else. To Elspeth, they were everything. The work began the next day. The materials were sourced from the land itself. The cost was her labor. She found a rich vein of clay by the creek bed. For 2 weeks she dug it out, mixed it with water and prairie grass, and began forming crude 6-inch diameter pipes. She laid them in the sun to harden, then built a makeshift kiln with fieldstone and baked them one by one. They were ugly, uneven, but they were airtight. This was the first thing people noticed. Elspeth Muir, the engineer's widow, making pottery in a field. Next, she turned to the church itself. It was a single large room, 40 feet long by 20 feet wide. The floor was made of heavy, flat flagstones laid over dirt. With a crowbar and sheer will, she began prying them up, numbering each one with a piece of charcoal and stacking them carefully outside. It was back-breaking work. Caleb and Anna helped where they could, carrying smaller stones, bringing her water. Beneath the flagstones was packed earth. She began to dig. She dug a main trench 2 feet deep from the fissure in the rock, running it straight under the center of the church foundation. Then she dug a series of smaller, shallower trenches branching off like the veins of a leaf. Now, here's where the quiet brilliance of Thomas's lessons came into play. She wasn't just going to vent hot steam under her floor. That would create a damp, muddy mess. She was building a contained system, a closed-loop radiant heat system, decades before such a term was common. She carefully laid her baked clay pipes in the trenches. The main pipe from the fissure was the largest. She packed clay and small stones around the opening at the rock face, creating a seal that would channel the hot, moist air directly into her system. The smaller pipes branched off, covering the entire area beneath the floor. Crucially, she laid them on a slight, almost imperceptible grade. The steam would enter, transfer its heat to the pipes and the surrounding earth, and as it cooled and condensed into water, it would flow down the grade to a single collection point. From there, a final pipe would carry the distilled water out to a drainage ditch 100 feet away from the church. The physics was sound. Water vapor carries a massive amount of latent heat energy. When it condenses back into liquid, it releases that energy. Every pound of steam condensing in her pipes would release nearly 1,000 BTUs of heat directly into the soil and rock beneath her floor. The Earth itself would become a massive, slow-release thermal battery. It was an engineering principle Thomas had used to prevent mine shafts from icing over in the winter. After the pipes were laid, she covered them with a foot of sand and gravel from the creek bed, tamping it down until it was firm. This layer would diffuse the heat, spreading it evenly. Then, painstakingly, she began to relay the original flagstones, matching the charcoal numbers. The floor was now a giant, passive radiator. While this was happening, she worked on the building itself. She taught Caleb how to mix mud and straw to chink the gaps in the old stone walls. She bartered her late husband's surveying equipment at the trading post for 10 glass panes and enough lumber to frame them. For the larger openings, she stretched oiled canvas, which wouldn't be clear, but would be airtight and translucent. She spent a week on the roof, replacing rotted shingles with new ones. She split herself from a fallen cottonwood. By mid-September, the structure was sealed. From the outside, it still looked like a forgotten relic, but inside it was a clean, cavernous, single-room home. A thick curtain divided their sleeping area from the main living space. The air was dry and smelled of stone and clean earth. Total cost, out of pocket, $4 for the nails and hardware she couldn't salvage. Everything else came from the land and her own 2 hands. Her brother-in-law, Arthur, visited as she was laying the final flagstone. He looked at the floor, then at the empty space where a stove should be. "Elspeth, it's a root cellar. How are you going to stay warm?" She simply patted the stone beneath her feet. "The heat is already here, Arthur. We just have to let it in." He left that day convinced his sister-in-law was not just grieving, but dangerously detached from reality. He told his new wife that he feared for the children, and when neighbors saw the finished work, they didn't see engineering. They saw poverty and desperation. They saw a woman building a tomb for her family. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began with quiet concern, but soon curdled into open mockery. The first to deliver a verdict was Jedediah Thorne. Thorne ran the sawmill, owned half the businesses in town, and had built nearly every proper house in Prairie Ridge. He saw himself as the arbiter of sound construction, a man who understood the brutal physics of a Dakota winter. He stopped by one afternoon in early October, his buggy kicking up dust. He walked into the church, his boots loud on the stone floor. He looked at the sealed walls, the oiled canvas windows, and the conspicuous lack of a chimney. "Mrs. Muir," he began, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "I've built 30 homes in this territory. I know what it takes to keep a family from freezing." He stamped a boot on the flagstone. "This is stone. It leaches heat. And you're planning to run steam under it?" Elspeth nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. "That's the idea, Mr. Thorne." Thorne let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ma'am, with all due respect to your late husband, that's not how you heat a building. That's how you grow mold and pneumonia. The damp will come right up through the floor. It will rot every piece of wood in here. You'll be colder and sicker than if you were in a tent. The condensation will turn this place into a cave of ice." His objection was technical, specific, and it sounded entirely reasonable. Elspeth's response was quiet. "I've accounted for the condensation." "Have you?" Thorne shook his head, a look of finality on his face. "You'll be begging for cordwood come December. I'll set a cord aside for you. You'll need it." He walked out without another word. His professional identity had been challenged by a widow with a shovel, and he dismissed it out of hand. The public mockery was crueler. It happened at the trading post. Silas Black, a trapper with a face like cured leather and a voice that carried, saw her buying flour and salt. He called out across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Heard Elspeth's trying to boil God out of the old church. Reckon she'll steam herself clean out of her senses by Christmas." A few men snickered. The store owner busied himself with a barrel of nails. Elspeth paid for her goods, her face a calm mask, and walked out. The cruel nickname stuck. From then on, the building was Elspeth's Steamer, or the Widow's Folly. The gossip network lit up. At the quilting circle, the women spoke in pitying tones. "Poor thing, her mind is gone. Those children living on a damp stone floor." The talk was a constant low hum of disapproval. Men would ride their horses out to the edge of her property just to stare at the old church, shaking their heads before riding on. They saw no smoke from a chimney, and to them no smoke meant no fire, no warmth, no life. The institutional skepticism arrived with the circuit preacher, Reverend Miller. He was a thin, earnest man who believed the world operated on principles laid down in Scripture and common sense. He found Elspeth outside, splitting the last of the cottonwood for her small cooking fire, which she kept outside. "Mrs. Muir," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. "The ladies of the church are concerned. There are established ways of providing for a family. A proper hearth is a blessing from the Lord." He gestured vaguely at the church. This is not in any manual of good husbandry I've ever seen. It's not natural, relying on vapors from the earth." "It's just heat, Reverend," Elspeth said, "same as from a fire." "It is not the same," he insisted gently. "It is damp heat, unwholesome. I must urge you to reconsider, for the children's sake." But the cut that went deepest came from family. Her brother-in-law, Arthur, came again in late November. The first deep cold had settled in, with nights dropping into the teens. He brought a load of firewood on his wagon, unasked. "Elspeth, you have to stop this," he pleaded, his voice laced with genuine concern and exasperation. "This has gone on long enough. People are talking. They're not just saying you're eccentric. They're saying you're an unfit mother, that you're either scared to ask for help or too proud to admit you're incompetent. Maybe both." This was the blow that truly hurt. The accusation that she was failing her children, that this wasn't an act of desperate innovation, but one of foolish pride. She looked at her brother-in-law, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. Her voice, when it came, was level. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Arthur. I'm trying to keep my family warm. Leave the wood. I'll use it for cooking." He left it, defeated. By the first week of December, not one person in Prairie Ridge thought Elspeth Muir had solved anything. They thought she had built a monument to her own stubborn grief, a cold, damp, foolish grave. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Elspeth right. It changed how people in that corner of the world thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1888 is still recorded in the State Climatology Archives as one of the most severe in the 20th century. It wasn't just a storm, it was a siege. The assault began with temperature. December 8th, the thermometer at the trading post read -18 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. People grumbled and threw another log on the fire. December 12th, it was minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The grumbling stopped. A quiet fear began to set in. December 18th, the mercury bottomed out at minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds gusting to 40 miles per hour. The effective wind chill was below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and it did not let up. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in Prairie Ridge never climbed above zero. The snow came with the cold, not in soft blankets, but as a fine, hard powder driven by the relentless wind. It didn't just fall, it drilled, finding every crack and seam in the walls of the cabins. The community began to break down under the strain. The suffering was no longer abstract. It had names and faces. The Colby Ranch, the largest in the area, was burning through 2 cords of expensive seasoned oak per week, and their large ranch house was holding a desperate 42 degrees Fahrenheit in the main room. In the bedrooms, water froze. Their cattle began to die, freezing to death in the barns. Jedediah Thorne, the town's expert builder, found his own home failing. He had a family of 6, and they were all living in the kitchen, the only room they could keep above 50 degrees. He was burning green pine from his own mill, his supply of seasoned hardwood exhausted by the town's frantic demand. The wet wood sizzled and smoked, coating his chimney with creosote. Other families had it worse. The Webbers, a young family with a newborn, ran out of wood entirely. The husband tried to chop down a frozen cottonwood, and the steel axe head shattered like glass in the brutal cold. They started burning their furniture. The Millers, the preacher's family, had their chimney plugged with ice and soot, filling their cabin with choking smoke. They had to put the fire out, huddling together under blankets in a 20-degree room. Children across the valley were sick, their coughs echoing in the frigid air. It was a slow-motion disaster, and then people started noticing the church. At first, it was just an oddity. Silas Black, the trapper, was heading out to check his frozen lines and passed by Elspeth's land. He saw a thin wisp of vapor rising from the small drainage ditch she had dug, but saw no smoke at all from the church itself. That was strange. The ground shouldn't be steaming. A few days later, Arthur, worried sick, rode out during a brief lull in the wind. He expected to find a scene of grim survival, or worse. He expected to have to rescue his niece and nephew. As he got closer, he saw Elspeth outside. She was wearing her normal wool dress and a shawl, but no heavy coat. She was calmly sweeping snow from the stone path to her door, not hunched against the cold, but working with a steady, unhurried rhythm. It was minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. He rode up, his own breath freezing in his beard. "Elspeth, are you all right? Are the children well?" She looked up, not surprised to see him. "We're fine, Arthur. We're managing." Her calmness was more unsettling than a plea for help would have been. He couldn't reconcile the image of this woman in a simple shawl with the brutal, life-threatening temperature. He looked at the church. Stone walls, no smoke. It made no sense. He turned his horse and rode back to town, more confused than ever. The reports trickled in. A rider passing at night saw a soft, steady lamplight glowing through the canvas windows. Not the flickering, desperate light of a family about to freeze, but the calm light of a home. The contrast was stark. Every other cabin in the valley was either dark to conserve fuel or had smoke pouring from the chimney, a sign of a fire being burned at an unsustainable rate. Elspeth's church was silent, smokeless, and serene. If you're still here, stay with me, because the number that came out of this strange stone building didn't just surprise the valley. It fundamentally rewrote their understanding of warmth. The breaking point came on December 23rd. The temperature had been below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 straight days. Jedediah Thorne, his pride finally overcome by a sense of duty and a growing, gnawing curiosity, loaded a quarter cord of his best remaining oak onto a sledge. He told his wife he was going to check on the widow Muir. He was certain he'd find a family on the verge of freezing to death. He was going to save them and, in doing so, prove his point. He was bringing emergency cordwood. He pulled the sledge through the deep, squeaking snow. The cold was so intense, it felt like a physical weight, pressing on his chest, burning his lungs. When he reached the church, he saw no signs of distress, no frantic waving, no desperate cries, just the quiet stone building and the eerie wisp of steam from the ditch. He hammered on the heavy wooden door. It swung open, and the warmth hit him. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth. It hit him like stepping from January into May. He stood there, speechless, the brutally cold air from outside swirling around his legs. Elspeth stood in the doorway. She was in a simple cotton dress, no shawl, no sweater. Behind her, through the cabin opening, Thorne saw the image that would forever crystallize the vindication. Caleb and Anna were sitting at a rough-hewn wooden table, drawing on a piece of slate. They were in their shirt sleeves, not coats, not blankets, shirt sleeves. His mind struggled to process the information. He stammered, "Everything all right?" "We're fine, Jedediah," Elspeth said, her voice calm. "We're managing fine. Do you need to come in?" He couldn't move. He just stared. "Your stove? Where's your fire?" "We don't have one inside," she said. "Just the cook fire outside." "But how much wood are you burning?" It was the only metric he understood. "Just for cooking," she repeated. "A few branches a day. We haven't touched our main wood pile." Thorne's mind reeled. He was burning half a cord a week just to keep one room at 50 degrees. The Colbys were burning 2 cords a week to hold 42. He was looking at a woman who was burning almost nothing, and her children were in shirt sleeves. It was impossible. "What's the temperature in here?" he finally managed to ask. Elspeth gestured to a small mercury thermometer hanging on the stone wall, one of her husband's old instruments. Thorne stepped inside, his body tingling as it adjusted to the warmth. He walked to the wall. The children looked up at him, unafraid. He squinted at the small glass tube. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He stared at it for a long moment. 58 degrees. Outside, it was minus 38. A difference of 96 degrees. He felt the floor with his hand. It wasn't hot, but it was distinctly warm to the touch, like a sun-baked rock in late summer. He walked the length of the room. The temperature was even everywhere. There were no cold spots, no drafts. He turned back to Elspeth. He looked at the thermometer again. He looked at the children, comfortable and safe in their light clothing. He looked at the solid, unadorned stone walls. He was a man who had built his entire life and reputation on a set of principles: wood, fire, insulation, fighting the cold. And in one moment, all of those principles were rendered obsolete. He finally understood. The heat wasn't coming from a fire. It was rising from the very ground he stood on. The entire building was a slow, steady radiator. Elspeth hadn't built a shelter to keep a fire in. She had built a system that turned the earth itself into a furnace. Let that sink in for a moment. The data was irrefutable. The Colby Ranch. 2 cords of wood per week. Interior temperature of 42 degrees Fahrenheit. Jedediah Thorne's house. 0.5 cords of wood per week. 1 room at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The Weber family, burning furniture to stay above freezing. Elspeth Muir's church, a few sticks for cooking, interior temperature of 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. Thorne stood there in the center of the warm room for what felt like an eternity. He was a proud man, a man whose word was law when it came to building. He finally looked at Elspeth, his face a mixture of awe and shame. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "We've been doing this wrong," he said. Not to her, but to the room, to himself, to 70 years of frontier tradition. "We've been fighting the cold from the inside out. You're fighting it from the ground up. We've been doing it wrong the whole time." This was more than just survival. This was dignity. Caleb and Anna did their lessons without shivering. Elspeth cooked and mended in normal clothes. They slept through the night, warm and secure, under a single blanket each. The system turned winter from something to be endured into something to be lived through. Word of Thorne's visit spread through the town like a wildfire. At first it was disbelief, but Thorne was not a man given to fantasy. He started sending other men out to see for themselves. Each one came back shaken, with the same story of impossible, even warmth. Reverend Miller arrived a week later, his face grim. He too was hit by the wall of warmth. He checked the thermometer himself. He touched the warm floor. He left without a sermon, simply murmuring, "The Lord truly does work in mysterious ways." The validation became official when the county extension agent, a young man from back east named Peterson, made his rounds in January to assess the damage from the deep freeze. He'd heard the rumors of the steam church and arrived with a calibrated thermometer, expecting to debunk a local myth. He measured the floor temperature at 65 degrees. He measured the air temperature at 58 degrees. He measured the outside temperature at -22. He recorded it all in his logbook, his scientific skepticism melting away in the gentle heat. Elspeth, it turned out, had kept meticulous records herself. Dates, exterior and interior temperatures, notes on the system's performance. This wasn't luck, it was data. It was engineering. By the end of the winter of 1888, the mockery had turned to awe. The widow's folly was now known as the Warm Church, and Elspeth Muir was no longer the crazy widow. She was the woman who had understood the ground beneath their feet better than any of them. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened faster than any social shift in the town's history. The first convert was a practical man facing a crisis. Mark Egan was a blacksmith whose wife had just given birth to twins in February. Their small cabin was drafty, and he lived in constant fear of the babies getting sick. He'd seen the inside of Elspeth's church, and he was a man who respected results over talk. He went to Elspeth, hat in hand. He didn't have a hot spring on his property, but he did have a good, deep well. He asked her if the principle was the same. Elspeth thought for a moment, recalling conversations with Thomas about geothermal gradients, the simple fact that the earth is warmer the deeper you go. She explained that he could dig a trench below the frost line, run a loop of sealed pipe down it, and circulate a fluid, brine most likely, to pull the steady 50-degree temperature from the deep earth into his floor. It wouldn't be as powerful as her steam vent, but the principle of using the earth as a heat source was the same. Egan built a simpler version. He didn't have clay pipes, so he used sealed iron ones from his smithy. He dug a deep 6-foot trench and ran the pipes through it before they entered his cabin. It was a rudimentary geothermal heat pump. The result was staggering. His cabin, which had struggled to stay at 40 degrees, now held a steady 52 degrees, and he was using half the firewood. His wife and the newborn twins were warm and safe. This proved the principle was replicable. The idea began to spread. That spring, families weren't just chinking their walls. They were looking at the ground differently. They were digging. By the end of the summer, 7 families had implemented some version of Elspeth's system. 12 by the following winter. They called them ground-heated floors, or Moore floors. Jedediah Thorne himself, the authority critic, supervised the construction of 3 of them, freely admitting he was learning as he went. He incorporated a shallow, steam-fed, radiant floor into the foundation of the new schoolhouse he was building. The official documentation came from Mr. Peterson, the extension agent. He wrote a detailed bulletin for the Territorial Agricultural Service titled Subterranean Heating, an Examination of Geothermal and Earth-Sheltered Principles for Prairie Dwellings. It featured his precise measurements from Elspeth's church, diagrams of her pipe system, and testimonials from Mark Ugen and other early adopters. He called it the Muir-Thorne method, giving Jedediah credit for helping to standardize and spread the design. The idea radiated outward. Within a decade, variations could be found across the Dakotas and into Montana. Some used hot springs. Others used deep earth loops. The core concept remained. Stop fighting the winter with fire alone. Make an ally of the earth. What Elspeth Muir built in 1887 out of desperation and memory, anticipated by nearly a century the principles that modern building scientists would rediscover and champion. Elspeth never sought credit or fortune from it. When people praised her ingenuity, she would simply shake her head. "It was Thomas's knowledge," she would say. "I just did the work." She lived in that warm stone church for the rest of her life, raising her children in comfort and security. The building still stands today, a local landmark. The geothermal system, with a few minor repairs, still works. The story of the warm church isn't just about survival. It's about a different way of seeing. The people of Prairie Ridge looked at the ground and saw dirt. Elspeth Muir, guided by the knowledge of the man she'd lost, saw a furnace. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound solutions aren't found in new inventions, but in a deeper understanding of the world that's already there. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition. It rewarded what worked. What's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. And be sure to subscribe for one proven frontier technique every week. Your support helps us keep these stories alive. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction of events. The characters and specific names used are fictional, but the engineering principles, geothermal heating, radiant floors, and thermal mass are based on real historical and modern building practices. The severe winter of 1888 was a real and devastating historical event in the Dakota Territory.